The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Sergeant Michael Chen adjusted his uniform for the 100th time. Today marked his first day as a tomb guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier, a position he had trained 18 months to achieve. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than the rifle on his shoulder as he approached the white marble monument that honored America's unidentified fallen soldiers. Michael had heard stories from other guards about disrespectful visitors, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. The cemetery was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning, with tour groups scattered across the grounds and families paying their respects to loved ones. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost sacred, as visitors moved quietly through the hallowed grounds. As Michael began his ceremonial walk along the mat in front of the tomb, he noticed a group of 5 young men in their early 20s approaching the barrier. They wore expensive clothes and carried themselves with an arrogance that immediately set off warning bells in his mind. Their loud voices and careless laughter cut through the reverent silence like a knife through silk. The leader of the group, a tall blond man with sunglasses pushed up on his head, pointed at Michael and said something to his friends that made them all burst into laughter. Michael maintained his composure, continuing his precise 21 steps across the mat, executing his ritual turn with military precision. His training had taught him to remain focused regardless of distractions. But something about this group felt different. The blond man pulled out his phone and began recording, narrating loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Look at this guy marching back and forth like a robot. What a waste of taxpayer money. These soldiers are probably just doing this for show anyway. His friends encouraged him, laughing and making crude jokes about the ceremony. Other visitors began to notice the disturbance. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair, visiting with his granddaughter, looked visibly upset by the group's behavior. A young mother quickly ushered her children away from the area, not wanting them to witness such disrespect. The sacred atmosphere that had defined the morning was rapidly deteriorating. Michael completed another pass, his jaw clenched but his expression unchanged. Every muscle in his body remained disciplined, every step perfectly measured. The group's behavior was escalating, but he had sworn an oath to maintain his post regardless of circumstances. The tomb of the unknown soldier deserved nothing less than his complete dedication. The blond man stepped closer to the barrier, his phone still recording.
"Hey, tin soldier,"
he called out, his voice echoing across the quiet cemetery. Can you do some tricks for the camera? Maybe march faster? We're getting bored over here. His friends found this hilarious, their laughter growing louder and more obnoxious with each passing moment. Several other visitors had stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. Some looked angry, others appeared shocked by the blatant disrespect being displayed. A park ranger stationed nearby began walking toward the group, but he was still several hundred yards away. The tension in the air was becoming thick enough to cut. Michael continued his march, but inside something was building. This wasn't just about him or his dignity. This was about every unknown soldier lying beneath that marble, every family who never got to say goodbye, every sacrifice made in the name of freedom. These young men had no idea what they were truly mocking. The group's leader took another step closer to the barrier, his confidence growing with each passing second. He had no way of knowing that he was about to cross a line that would change everything. The peaceful morning was about to become something none of them would ever forget. The blond man, emboldened by his friend's laughter and the growing audience, decided to push things further. This is so boring, he announced loudly, pocketing his phone. Watch this, guys. I bet I can make Robot Boy break character. Without warning, he stepped over the low chain barrier that separated visitors from the sacred ground around the tomb. The moment his foot touched the restricted area, several things happened simultaneously. Other visitors gasped audibly, some pointing and others covering their mouths in shock. The elderly veteran in the wheelchair began trying to wheel himself closer, his face red with anger. Children who had been playing quietly nearby stopped and stared, sensing that something serious was happening. Michael noticed the intrusion immediately but continued his march, completing his current pass before beginning the next. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario, though it rarely occurred. Most visitors respected the sanctity of the tomb and the barriers put in place to protect it. This group was clearly different. The blond man's friends cheered him on from behind the barrier. "Go, Brad. Show them who's boss," one of them shouted. Take a selfie with the statue, another added. Brad grinned widely, clearly enjoying the attention and the shocked reactions from the crowd. He had no understanding of the significance of where he stood or what he had just triggered. Brad walked casually toward the tomb itself, his expensive sneakers making soft sounds on the sacred ground. He pulled his phone back out, switching to selfie mode and positioning himself for a photo. "This is going to get so many likes," he said to his friends, completely oblivious to the fury building in the faces of the veterans and military families watching. Michael completed his 21 steps and executed his turn. Instead of beginning his next pass, he stopped and faced directly toward Brad. The sudden change in routine was immediately noticeable to everyone present. The atmosphere shifted from shocked disapproval to electric anticipation. Something was about to happen. A park ranger was now running toward the scene, but he was still too far away to intervene quickly. Security cameras throughout the cemetery were undoubtedly recording everything, but Brad seemed unconcerned about any potential consequences. His arrogance had reached dangerous levels. "What's wrong, soldier boy?" Brad called out mockingly, still holding his phone up for a selfie. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you not allowed to talk to us regular people?" His friends laughed even harder, some of them now recording the encounter on their own phones. They had no idea they were about to witness something extraordinary. Michael took a single step forward, his rifle still at the perfect angle, his posture unchanged. But something in his demeanor shifted subtly. The practiced calm of his expression remained, but there was now an intensity behind his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. The crowd sensed it too, the chatter and murmurs dying down as everyone focused on what was about to unfold. Brad, still completely unaware of the gravity of the situation, turned his back to Michael to get a better angle for his selfie with the tomb. "This is perfect," he said to his phone camera. "I'm standing where tourists aren't supposed to go, and the guard can't do anything about it because he has to stay in character." The elderly veteran had managed to wheel himself close enough to shout, "Son, you need to get out of there right now." But Brad just waved dismissively at the old man. "Mind your own business, Gramps. This doesn't concern you." That dismissal of the veteran seemed to be the final straw for many observers. Angry murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Some people were already pulling out their phones to call security or police. The peaceful morning had transformed into something tense and volatile. Michael took another step forward and then another. His movements were deliberate and controlled, but unmistakably purposeful. The ritual marching had ended. Something else was beginning. Brad was about to learn that there are consequences for showing disrespect at one of America's most sacred sites. Michael's voice cut through the morning air with the precision of a blade and the authority of thunder. "It is requested that everyone maintain an atmosphere of silence and respect at all times at the tomb of the unknown soldier." His words carried across the cemetery with such power that conversations dozens of yards away stopped. Mid-sentence, Brad spun around, startled by the sudden sound. For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, his confident smirk faltered slightly. He had expected the guard to remain silent, to continue his robotic march regardless of what happened. The commanding voice that had just addressed the crowd was not what he had anticipated. "That includes you, sir," Michael continued, his eyes locked directly on Brad. "You will immediately return behind the barriers and show proper respect for this sacred ground." The tone was not angry or emotional, but carried an unmistakable authority that made even the most casual observers straighten their postures. Brad's friends exchanged nervous glances behind the barrier. The laughter had died in their throats, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. What had started as a fun prank was suddenly feeling much more serious. The crowd around them had grown larger, and the faces staring at them were no longer just shocked. They were angry. "Are you kidding me?" Brad said, trying to reclaim his bravado. "It's just a bunch of old stones. These dead guys can't hear us anyway." He raised his phone again, attempting to continue taking selfies. "This is America, right? Freedom of speech and all that?" A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Several veterans in the audience took steps forward, their faces red with anger. The elderly man in the wheelchair was being restrained by his granddaughter, who could see he was about to try to stand up despite his condition. The tension in the air became almost unbearable. Michael began walking directly toward Brad, each step measured and deliberate. His rifle remained at the proper angle, his uniform impeccable. but there was now an unmistakable sense of purpose in his movement. This was no longer the ceremonial guard performing a ritual. This was a soldier protecting something sacred. "Sir, you have 10 seconds to comply with my instructions," Michael announced, his voice carrying even further across the cemetery. "This is your only warning." The professionalism in his voice was absolute, but underneath it was something that made Brad's friends take an involuntary step backward. Brad looked around nervously for the first time, finally beginning to realize that the situation had escalated beyond his control. The crowd was now quite large, with dozens of people watching his every move. Park rangers were approaching from multiple directions, though they were still several minutes away. Security personnel from the cemetery's main building were also en route. "Whatever, dude," Brad said, trying to sound casual but his voice cracking slightly. "I'm not breaking any real laws here. You can't actually do anything to me. You're just for show." He took another step closer to the tomb itself, partly out of defiance and partly because he wasn't sure what else to do. Michael stopped walking when he was about 10 feet away from Brad. At this distance, the size difference between the two men became apparent. While Brad was tall, Michael was built like the trained soldier he was, with broad shoulders and the bearing of someone who had faced real danger. His presence seemed to fill the space around him. The tomb of the unknown soldier is guarded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, Michael said, his voice now carrying a tone that made everyone listening understand they were witnessing something significant. "These soldiers died for your freedom to act like a fool, but that freedom does not extend to desecrating their resting place." The crowd had grown completely silent, except for the sound of footsteps as more people approached to see what was happening. Even Brad's friends had stopped encouraging him, sensing that their companion had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. The morning sun seemed to intensify, casting sharp shadows across the white marble of the tomb. Brad's phone was still in his hand, but he had lowered it slightly. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he might be in real trouble. The confident arrogance that had carried him this far was beginning to crumble as he found himself face to face with someone who represented everything he had been mocking. Michael took one more step closer to Brad, and suddenly the young man realized he was in the presence of someone who had trained for situations far more dangerous than this. The guard's composure was absolute, but there was an intensity in his eyes that spoke of real consequences for continued defiance. "You want to know what's under this tomb?" Michael asked, his voice carrying clearly to every person in the growing crowd. "These are soldiers who died in wars defending the very freedoms you're abusing right now. They died so far from home that their families never even got their bodies back. This isn't just stone and marble. This is a memorial to sacrifice you can't even begin to understand." Brad's hand holding the phone began to shake slightly. The reality of where he was and what he was doing was finally sinking in. Around him he could see veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens who looked at him with a mixture of disgust and anger. What had seemed like harmless fun minutes ago now felt like the biggest mistake of his life. These unknown soldiers could be someone's grandfather, someone's son, someone's father, Michael continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "They gave everything for their country, and in return we promised them eternal honor and respect. You are violating that promise with every second you remain on this sacred ground." An elderly woman in the crowd began to cry quietly. She clutched a small American flag in her hand, and those near her could see she was wearing a Gold Star mother pin, indicating she had lost a son or daughter in military service. The sight of her tears seemed to affect everyone present, including Brad's friends, who were now looking everywhere except at their companion. Brad tried to speak but found his mouth had gone dry. The confident words that had come so easily before seemed to have deserted him completely. He looked back toward his friends for support, but they were all avoiding eye contact, clearly wanting no part of what was happening. I was just," Brad started, but Michael raised his hand, and the words died in his throat. "Sir, you have 5 seconds to return behind the barriers," Michael said, his voice now carrying the full authority of the United States military. 1. The single word rang out like a gunshot in the silence. The crowd collectively held its breath. Park rangers were now close enough to intervene if necessary, but everyone sensed that this moment belonged to the guard and the young man who had challenged the sanctity of the tomb. 2. Michael's voice was unwavering, professional, and absolutely final. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that reaching 5 would bring consequences that Brad was not prepared to face. Brad's expensive sneakers seemed glued to the ground. He wanted to move, knew he should move, but something about the moment had paralyzed him. The weight of dozens of eyes watching him, judging him, combined with the overwhelming presence of the guard in front of him, made him feel smaller than he ever had in his life. 3. The word echoed off the marble of the tomb itself, seeming to carry the voices of all the unknown soldiers resting beneath it. Several people in the crowd were now recording the encounter, but their phones were pointed at Brad, not in support but as evidence of his shameful behavior. A bead of sweat rolled down Brad's forehead despite the cool morning air. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The arrogance that had brought him to this moment had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing panic about what would happen when Michael reached 5. 4. The words seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Brad could see his own reflection in Michael's polished boots, could smell the crisp starch of his uniform, could feel the absolute dedication radiating from every inch of the man standing before him. In that moment, Brad finally understood what he was facing. This wasn't just a guard doing a job. This was a warrior sworn to protect something sacred, someone trained to follow through on every promise made. The countdown wasn't just numbers, it was the sound of his own reckoning approaching. Before Michael could say 5, something inside Brad finally broke. The weight of the moment, the intensity of the guard's presence, and the overwhelming realization of what he had done crashed down on him all at once. His phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the sacred ground. "I'm sorry," Brad suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with genuine fear and newfound understanding. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." He stumbled backward, nearly falling in his haste to distance himself from the tomb. The confident young man who had strutted past the barriers minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who finally grasped the magnitude of his disrespect. Michael stood perfectly still, watching as Brad scrambled to pick up his phone with shaking hands. The guard's expression remained unchanged, but there was something in his eyes that might have been satisfaction, not at Brad's fear, but at the young man's apparent awakening to the gravity of the situation. "Please," Brad continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I didn't mean any disrespect to the soldiers. I was just being stupid. I'm sorry." He looked around at the crowd, seeing for the first time the pain and anger in their faces. The elderly veteran in the wheelchair was wiping tears from his eyes. The Gold Star mother was still crying quietly, her small flag held tightly against her chest. Brad's friends had moved even further back from the barriers, clearly trying to distance themselves from their companions' actions. Some were already walking away entirely, apparently deciding that being associated with this incident was too damaging to their own reputations. The fair-weather friendship that had encouraged Brad's behavior was evaporating as quickly as his confidence had. Michael finally spoke, his voice still carrying absolute authority but with a slightly different tone. "The respect you show here is not for me, sir. It is for every soldier who died protecting the freedoms you enjoy. It is for every family who lost someone and never got to say goodbye. It is for the idea that some things in this world are worth dying for." Brad nodded frantically, backing toward the barriers while keeping his eyes on Michael. "Yes, sir. I understand now. I really do. I'm sorry." He reached the chain barrier and climbed back over it, his movements clumsy and hurried. Once back in the visitor area, he seemed to collapse slightly, the adrenaline and fear catching up with him. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many shaking their heads in disgust at what they had witnessed. Some approached Brad's friends to express their disapproval, while others simply walked away, not wanting to be part of the negativity any longer. The elderly veteran wheeled himself closer to where Brad stood. "Son," the old man said, his voice filled with decades of hard-earned wisdom, "those soldiers under that marble died so you could have the freedom to act like a fool. But freedom comes with responsibility. You just learned that lesson the hard way." Brad looked at the veteran, seeing for the first time the ribbons on his shirt, the weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of service, the dignity that comes from understanding sacrifice. "I know, sir. I'm really sorry. I don't know what came over me." The Gold Star mother approached slowly, her tears having stopped but her eyes still red. She didn't speak to Brad directly, but she looked at him with an expression that conveyed more disappointment than any words could have. In her face he could see the pain of loss, the weight of sacrifice, and the importance of the honor he had tried to mock. Michael, meanwhile, had returned to his position and resumed his ceremonial march. The sacred rhythm of 21 steps turn, 21 steps turn had begun again. The tomb was once more protected by its guardian, the dignity of the unknown soldiers restored, and the proper atmosphere of reverence re-established. Brad stood behind the barriers, watching the guards' precise movements, finally understanding what he was witnessing. This wasn't just ceremony or tradition. This was a living promise that America keeps to its fallen heroes. It was a pledge that their sacrifice would never be forgotten, that their memory would be honored, and that their resting place would be protected. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting the white marble of the tomb in brilliant light. The crisis had passed, but its lessons would linger long after the last observer had left the cemetery. Park rangers finally arrived at the scene, but the immediate crisis had already resolved itself. They spoke briefly with witnesses and took down information about what had occurred, while Brad stood nearby looking like a completely different person than the one who had arrived that morning. His expensive clothes seemed out of place now, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible shame. One of the rangers approached Brad and his remaining friends. "I need to see some identification," the ranger said firmly. "What happened here today will be documented, and there may be consequences for trespassing on restricted grounds." Brad handed over his driver's license with trembling hands, no longer able to meet anyone's eyes directly. As the ranger took down information, other visitors continued to arrive at the tomb, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Children with their parents, elderly couples holding hands, veterans visiting alone, all came to pay their respects to the unknown soldiers. The contrast between their reverent behavior and what Brad had done became even more stark. Michael continued his ceremonial duties without any acknowledgement of what had just occurred. To casual observers who arrived after the incident, everything appeared perfectly normal. The guard marched his precise steps, executed his perfect turns, and maintained his vigil over the tomb. This was exactly as it should be. The eternal watch continued regardless of any disruption. The elderly veteran wheeled himself closer to where Brad was still standing with the ranger. "Young man," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. I served 3 tours in Vietnam. I lost friends whose bodies were never recovered. This tomb represents them to me and to thousands of other families who never got closure." Brad looked down at the old soldier, seeing the pain in his weathered face. "I'm so sorry, sir. I really am. I never thought about it that way." His voice was barely audible, filled with genuine remorse that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "The guard who just confronted you?" The veteran continued. "He volunteers for this duty. It's one of the most selective positions in the military. He could be stationed anywhere in the world, but he chose to spend his time honoring the dead. That young man has more honor in his little finger than you showed in your entire life today." The Gold Star mother, who had been listening nearby, finally spoke to Brad directly. "My son died in Afghanistan," she said simply. "He was 22 years old. His body came home, so I was able to bury him properly. But for the families of these unknown soldiers, this tomb is the only grave they have." "You were dancing on someone's grave." The weight of her words hit Brad like a physical blow. He had to lean against the barrier to steady himself. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for what I did. I'll never do anything like this again." She nodded slowly, studying his face to judge whether his remorse was genuine. "I hope you mean that," she said finally. "And I hope you'll think about this moment every time you see a flag or hear about soldiers serving overseas. Freedom isn't free and respect isn't optional." Brad's friends, what few remained, were clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. They had come expecting a fun day out, perhaps some social media content, and instead found themselves witnesses to their friends' public humiliation and personal reckoning. Some were already making excuses to leave, not wanting to be associated with the incident any longer. As the ranger finished taking statements, he turned to Brad with a serious expression. "You're lucky that guard handled this the way he did," he said. "Interfering with the tomb guards can result in federal charges. The fact that you showed remorse and complied when ordered probably saved you from spending the night in jail." Brad nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. I understand. Thank you. I really learned my lesson." He looked back toward Michael, who was continuing his march with the same precision and dedication he had shown all morning. Is there any way I can apologize to him properly?" The ranger shook his head. The guards don't break their vigil for personal conversations. But if you really want to show respect, you can stay and observe quietly for a while. Watch what real dedication looks like. Maybe visit the cemetery museum and learn about the soldiers who were buried here. For the first time since the incident began, Brad seemed to consider something beyond his own embarrassment. He looked at the tomb, at the guard, at the faces of the people around him, and something seemed to shift in his understanding. The sacred ground beneath his feet represented something much larger than he had ever realized. Brad made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of leaving with his embarrassed friends, he chose to stay. He found a bench at a respectful distance from the tomb and sat down to watch Michael continue his ceremonial duties. For the first time in his life, he began to truly observe what the guard was doing and why it mattered. As the morning progressed, Brad watched visitor after visitor approach the tomb with reverence. He saw veterans saluting, children asking their parents questions in whispered voices, and families laying flowers. Each person who came seemed to understand something he had missed entirely when he arrived. The tomb wasn't just a tourist attraction. It was a living memorial to sacrifice and service. Michael's relief guard arrived precisely on schedule, and Brad watched the changing of the guard ceremony for the first time with new eyes. The precision, the respect, the solemnity of the ritual became clear to him. These weren't just soldiers going through motions, they were men and women dedicating their lives to ensuring that America's unknown heroes were never forgotten. The elderly veteran rolled his wheelchair near Brad's bench. "You're still here," he observed with some surprise. "That's good. It means you might actually understand what you witnessed today." Brad nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "Sir," Brad finally said, "would you mind telling me about your service? I think I need to hear it." The old soldier looked at him carefully, then began to share stories of friends lost in battle, of the families who never got closure, of the importance of honoring those who gave everything for their country. Hours passed. Brad missed lunch, ignored text messages from friends, and canceled his afternoon plans. He visited the cemetery museum, read about the unknown soldiers, and learned about the history of the tomb. Each fact he learned made his morning behavior seem worse, but also helped him understand why the confrontation had been necessary. As the sun began to set, Brad found himself back at the tomb for the evening changing of the guard. The ceremony was even more moving in the golden light of sunset, and he found tears running down his cheeks as he watched. For the first time in his privileged life, he truly understood what sacrifice meant. The Gold Star mother approached him as the ceremony concluded. "You stayed all day," she observed. Brad wiped his eyes and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I needed to understand what I had done wrong. I think I'm starting to get it now." She studied his face again, seeing something different than she had that morning. "My son would have been about your age now," she said softly. "I hope if he had ever made a mistake like you did today, someone would have taught him the way that guard taught you. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones." Brad reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. "Ma'am, would you mind helping me buy some flowers for the tomb? I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I'd like to do something respectful before I leave." Together they walked to the cemetery's flower stand. Brad chose white roses and returned to the tomb. Under the watchful eye of the evening guard, he placed the flowers at the base of the monument with more care and reverence than he had ever shown for anything in his life. As he prepared to leave, Brad took one last look at the tomb and the guard standing watch. The young soldier was about his own age, probably from a similar background but serving something greater than himself. Brad realized that the guard hadn't just protected the tomb that morning. He had protected Brad from becoming someone he would have regretted being forever. Walking through the cemetery gates, Brad felt like a different person than the one who had entered that morning. His phone, which had been silent all day, buzzed with messages from friends asking about his day. Instead of responding with the kind of social media posts he usually made, he simply turned it off. The lesson of the tomb guard would stay with Brad for the rest of his life. 30 seconds of confrontation had changed everything, not through force or punishment, but through the simple power of witnessing true dedication and understanding the weight of respect. The unknown soldiers resting beneath the marble had gained one more person who would ensure their sacrifice was never forgotten. Years later, Brad would return to Arlington National Cemetery, not as a disrespectful tourist, but as a man who understood the true meaning of honor. And every time he saw a flag or heard about military service, he would remember the morning when a tomb guard taught him that some things in life are sacred and that protecting them is worth everything.